Hello and welcome to the 2021 U.S. Play Coalition Conference. My name is Angela Novak and I am at the University, East Carolina University. I know where I work, I think. East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. That's where I work. I live in Wake Forest. North Carolina, and which is not where Wake Forest University is, but where Wake Forest University is where my fantastic co-presenter is. And if you listen to my presentation last year, which was on a very similar topic, you heard me say her name approximately 3,422 times because she is a person that I credit with bringing me into the field of play. I had a definite interest and a definite I would say infatuation with play, and she definitely pulled me fully onto the dark side. And so I am delighted that she is with me today presenting. And so I will introduce you happily to Sylvan Taylor.
Hi, I'm Sylvan Taylor. I already got a wonderful introduction from Angela, but I am a school enrichment teacher at the Downtown School, which is a public magnet, a wonderful public magnet in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, home of Wake Forest, as Angela just told you. And my play journey began, about 8 years ago, really, when I took some time off from teaching in public schools to run my own in-home preschool play school, and really dug into the world of play and the realm of play work as a field of academic study. So I'm very excited to bring that into a public school setting and to do work with Angela, bringing that to different audiences.
So we are starting off with a quote that those of you who are at the Play Coalition probably have heard of Peter Gray. And so, sorry, in the background, you also have my dog sneezing. So this is a quote from Peter Gray, that perhaps play would be more respected if it was called something like self-motivated practice of life skills, but that would, of course, remove the lightheartedness from it and thereby reduce its effectiveness. So we're stuck with this paradox. We have to accept the triviality of play in order to realize its sheer volume and how important it is. And so when we are talking about this topic, there is this balance that we are trying to achieve in terms of not trivializing play, but also realizing the great impact it has. And so when we talk about this presentation, when we go through this presentation, what we want to make sure that stays as a central theme is that we are not here to edukify play. We're not here to tell you how to turn play into education and how to make play into an educational strategy. Play is play, and we want play to remain play. And in that, we want to give you a few seconds, and ask you to think and imagine a time of play. So close your eyes. It's always best if you close your eyes. And as you're listening to this at home in a recording, you can always pause and give yourself a lot more think time than we give you. It's the benefit of at home and on a recording. You can take a few minutes and journal. You can take a few minutes and really draw a picture, do something to really get into this memory. But think and reflect and take some time to remember and think about play and a memory you have of play. Now we're going to ask you a couple questions about that memory you had. And Sylvan's like dying over there wanting to ask the question. So even though it's my slide, I can see her face because she really wants to ask the question. So I'm going to let her ask the questions.
So the first question I always like to ask people is, where are you? You know, where do you picture yourself in this moment of play that came to your mind? Are you outside, inside? Who's with you? Are you alone? Are you with other children? Are there adults around? Most people say no. Adults aren't around in this memory, this really vivid play memory. And perhaps even you're doing something that if there are adults around, they would say no to. And the value of that, most of us also were probably outside. Maybe you were high in a tree, or maybe you were really engaged in digging in the dirt and finding what was down there. Maybe you were building something, or you set something on fire, or something else that might be seen as dangerous to adults. But if you dig into that,
on fire.
Oh yeah, a lot of my childhood memories do involve fire and heights and things that perhaps I shouldn't have been doing, but they're so vivid. Those memories, they become just an integral part of who you are. And you can remember, I bet you are calling back sounds and smells and just sensory, the touch of whatever it is. You know, was it tree bark? Was it damp soil? And these are things that become core memories, that become part of who we are and part of how we see the world. You probably learned a lot about cause and effect. You probably learned perhaps something never to do again. And so putting yourself back in that space of being a child, in that flow state, that fully immersed state of play, and perhaps a little bit illicit, something that maybe you weren't supposed to be doing, gives you a sense of how vital those kinds of empowering experiences are for kids in developing the kinds of learning, sense of self, sense of confidence that helps propel them forward to be confident and capable learners. I doubt we have many memories of a worksheet or something similar sitting in a school desk. They're nearly as vivid as our memories of play. So keep that in mind as we move forward.
And so what this presentation is about is what we want you to think about is what to say when you are incorporating free play and when you are incorporating play in your classroom, when play is play, again, not when you are, we're not trying to push the education of play, but when you are playing, when you are incorporating free play in your classroom, how we approach this as bona fide part of our educational system as play, and what to say when the wolves are at the door, and what to say to defend play, to not necessarily even defend, but to justify the impact of play on and for children. And Sylvan likes to talk a little bit about the wolves at the door and why where the origin of that phrase came from in terms of, in her vernacular. I like the phrase because, as you can see, the Little Red Riding Hood, but where it comes from a play perspective.
Well, I love the analogy. I love the illustration here of the Little Red Riding Hood wolf. Although even more appropriately, we know that the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood did not come dressed as a wolf. He came disguised as grandma, right? And often those wolves that come knocking at your classroom door are not obvious wolves. I first encountered this phrase. You may be familiar with Lisa Murphy and her work, the Ooey Gooey Lady. She uses the term wolves at the door frequently. She's actually quoting Mimi Schenfeld in her book, Teaching in the Key of Life, where she talks about, she uses the wolves as the analogy of, it may be your administrators, it may be a parent who doesn't quite get what's going on and feels like their child should be learning more. Maybe it's that really old school teacher down the hall who doesn't approve of what's happening in your classroom. It could be anybody, that wolf comes in the form of grandma and it comes in the form of everybody else. But the people who come to your door and say, how can you prove what they're learning? How can you connect this to the standard? And what a lot of people end up doing is losing confidence in that value of child-led learning through play, that student voice and choice, that may look a little bit messy and may veer off that standardized plan a little bit. I'm not advocating for you bringing that fire into the classroom. I have a wonderfully supportive administrator, and that's my hard line. He says no fire. But when you're making oobleck, or when that child wants to climb up the slide or swing on their tummy, when the children are performing something and it's led by them, being able to explain, this is how they're building their social skills. This is how they're developing an understanding of physics and gravity, or states of matter. I mean, you can start seeing how potions play and all kinds of creative child-led activities can easily seg into those standards that we have to teach in more authentic, relatable ways, especially for your younger students. So when those wolves come to the door, you have to have ways to appease them, right? We want to appease them without compromising what we know is of value for children.
And so this, hopefully you're in the right session, but if not, hopefully you want to stick around anyway. This is the session description, and our agenda is as follows. We're going to talk about the importance of play. We're going to talk about some educational strategies and activities, and then we are going to talk about this Eduspeak piece. And when we talk about educational strategies and activities, again, we're not talking about how you turn play into education, but where some of the principles of play, where they are seen in education. So again, we're not, play is play, and the value of play is being play, but where we see the overlap. All right, and then here in bright yellow, it's part of the slide deck. It's bright. Is Mr. Rogers, and really two different sides of the thought behind play. One is from an educational perspective of the chance to practice learning. And in this, it is learning on their own. So it's not in terms of how we give children a chance to practice through play, but that, and if you've read some of Peter Gray's work as well, in terms of the original, his original research on the hunter-gatherer communities and this kind of thing, it's really looking at this perspective of when we practice by mimicking what adults do, then we play, and we play through this, we're really practicing for what we see life is. And so this idea of we're practicing life skills through play, we're practicing empathy, we're practicing motor skills, we're practicing a lot of what we are learning through life, in life through play. And then another piece, another quote from Mr. Rogers is looking at imagination and how imagination is a significant part of play as well, and how those go together in terms of play. But when we're, again, talking about Eduspeak, it is always very much a balancing act of keeping what of keeping free play, and not trying to turn it into something it's not. And Sylvan's going to talk about that in more depth.
Awesome. So why play? Why not something else entirely, right? And as we said, the idea here is not to educify play. Play and education are separate, but children learn through play. Think of the last time you learned something new, even as an adult. We learn much more quickly and much more deeply. We retain concepts better when we have some reason that's meaningful to us to learn that new skill. It's something valuable, it's something vital, it's something that we have to learn in the moment. And so watching children at play, true free play with loose parts, an environment that has a lot of freedom, and we'll go into what some of those terms mean for those of you who may not know a little later in the presentation, allows children opportunities to play with the kinds of concepts that we try to teach them in math and in science and in language arts in ways that are powerful and meaningful to them. And offer them the kinds of voice and choice that make them feel confident and help them own their learning. I've watched kids build pulley systems just for fun that get across those ideas of simple machines and force and motion in ways that no textbook ever could. I've watched kids build elaborate water moving systems to get their water from the water fountain over here to their mud kitchen through pipes and propping them up on buckets. We use that word grit so often in education today, and I'm not a tremendous fan of it, and many in equity circles are not, that the idea of kids sticking with something, I mean, that's important, right? But the state of flow, when you're engaged in something that you chose and you love, true task commitment, intrinsically motivated, that comes from play. That comes from the opportunities where children can just do what they choose to do and stick with it. And you see kids going through that whole design engineering process, coming up with a problem to solve, finding a way to solve it, building their prototype, testing it, and then going back around to stage one when something goes wrong. They don't give up. They persevere. Children are naturally resilient, and they have an opportunity to tap into that when they play. They also build those social emotional skills. You hear people all the time say that this is a collaborative job market, right? We want kids going to the job market that can communicate clearly, that can work with others well, that know that give and take of working with others. That comes through play. You can't force that. You can't teach it. Kids have to learn that through that intrinsic motivation of engaging with others and having to create a situation where everyone wants to continue. Play is the natural state of being for kids, and it's how they learn. So the more we can tap into that in a school setting, the more we can provide for that authentically, the better our learners will succeed and achieve.
And so this gets to what is play? And so for our purposes, and though there are, of course, different definitions of play, we use Peter Gray's. We have read other people, for the record. Stuart Brown, we are big fans of, and Sylvan has done quite a lot of training in play work itself, the play work that is through the different, well, not playwork.org, but playwork, through Britain. You explain it.
Well, play work is an actual academic field of study, right? And so there's something, it's much more prevalent in the UK. There are venture playgrounds and so forth. If you look up Playworks, I believe with an S in the United States, is a very different thing. It's very adult led, which is not at all what Playwork is. And I'm happy to talk about that more. But it is very closely aligned with the definition of play that Peter Gray or Stuart Brown, they're similar definitions, would get. So yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to make that distinction, but we're doing this after a long day of work and my brain is not quite functioning as well. That's what I was trying to make, the distinction of play works versus play work. But so the aspects of play that we're highlighting are from Peter Gray, and that is self-chosen, self-directed, and the fact that players are always free to quit. And it's activity in which the means are valued more than the ends. And this one for me is particularly particularly meaningful in the process aspect, in the process of play, and the that aspect of it, because that's something that is, I fear that education is really losing, sometimes really losing the value of in general, is the process rather than the product. And so I really connect with that particular aspect of the definition. Part 3 is the structure or rules. And this is really interesting when I first read it, because the fact that it has structure or rules, but that it's not dictated by any kind of outside source or entity. It's not that you read the rules in advance, but that they are, that the rules themselves are come up with by the players in the creation of the game, and that they can be changed by the players while the game is in motion or while the play is in motion, and that it takes the agreement of those players. And that's part of the activity, that's part of the formation of the play, is that's all part of the game, of the play, is coming up with these rules and coming up with this structure, and that they are in motion, but that it's not up to this outside entity to come up with the rules of play. So that's part of this idea of free play. The 4 is that it is imaginative and non-literal, and that it is somehow removed from the idea of real or serious life, which again is an interesting aspect of play, because when Peter Gray was studying play and studying hunter-gatherer communities, it was part of the study, and part of what he observed was that it was mimicry almost of what adults did, but it was still imaginative and removed from what was real and serious, but it was still this aspect of practice for real life. So it's this dichotomy there of imaginative and non-literal while still being real, in comparative to practice for real life. And then finally is this involvement of an active and alert but non-stressed frame of mind. So you are paying attention, you are active, you are alert to what's happening in play, but it's not a stressful experience in terms of the what's happening in your mind in terms of the stress state of mind. And so while you're active in play, it's not a stressful activation of your mind. And again, that is an important aspect of what's going on in terms of your body. And if you think about the anxiety and the anxiousness of play, especially if you think about sports and competition, and think about where that fits into the idea of play. So you're active and alert, but if you're anxious about the outcome, think about sports in terms of these rules of an activity in which means are valued more than ends, the structure or rules dictated by an outside entity, and active, alert, but non-stressed frame of mind. Would a sports competition fit into this idea of play? I mean, looking at those rules, where does that fit in?
So I'm going to talk through a few of the specific benefits of play with some vignettes. I'm a storyteller, so I'll tell them through stories. I also, just to kind of transition off of Angela's last point, that idea of the player, the person who is truly playing, not in an organized sport, not something organized by adults, but true free play, as we would define it, that active, alert, but non-stressed state of mind. Again, bringing that back to learning. How do we learn best? We learn best when we're not stressed, we're not upset, we're feeling good, we're feeling confident, we're feeling interested and engaged. We're not bored, we're not checked out, we're not passive, but we're also not stressed out and frightened. And so it's important to continue thinking about that, these mindsets and what that means for the child or for the adult in the setting. And so these guys, oh gosh, they're second graders now, but here they're 3-year-olds. I know I mentioned earlier that I have been a public school teacher for many, many years, but I took 4 years off to be at home with my own kids and run a play school in my home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And it was one of the greatest experiences of my career on many levels. And so these two had been together at this point for about 2 years. And I have permission to share these stories and photos, everyone that's here. But the little guy here was diagnosed as on the autism spectrum at 18 months, which is a very early age for that to be recognized. And he struggled with communication and social interactions at this stage. And so here they are rolling up on about 2. And they're painting. They like to play something called Art Museum. We went to the Art Museum as a field trip frequently, and we were going to go, and the class was canceled. And I don't remember why, but they said, can we do Art Museum here, Miss Dillon? And I said, sure, we can do Art Museum here. And so we'd set up easels and boxes and things, and we'd paint outside, and it's okay to get messy. And sometimes they would get messy, but they didn't paint each other. That was not part of Art Museum. Well, this little guy decided that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to paint other people. He liked painting himself. That was fun. And I'm going to paint my friends. And so he was going child by child, and there's 6 kids there, small little group, paint one kid. That kid would say no, or they would cry. He'd go on to the next one and paint them. And I was kind of holding back. You know, you have that drive as an adult to start thinking, okay, I'm going to step in and I'm going to stop this because he's upsetting his friends and this is not going to go well. Finally, comes this little girl. He swipes her with the paint and she giggles and she swipes him back. And then they start back and forth, paint, giggle, until you can see, you can feel the joy in that second picture, right? You can feel the joy, you can feel the connection. Verbal communication was not easy for him at this point, but he made a clear connection with the peer, and look at the joy it brought to both of them. What did that take? That took me stepping back. That took me letting them choose. Everything in this setting was chosen 100% by the children. And this far exceeded any experience that I could have contrived to try to get him to express something to his peers. He figured it out, and it resulted in pure magic. And every time I look at these pictures, it brings me joy. Something that couldn't have happened otherwise. So obviously this is a very early childhood setting. And we talk a lot about the social emotional learning in those early childhood settings because that's what's most valuable to them. All of the language, all of the foundations of math, all of the foundations of reading, that's going to come, right? Basic science, all of that. But if they don't have that foundation of communicating and connecting with each other, the other lessons aren't going to come as easily or as meaningfully. Now, I'm now in a public elementary school setting working with older kids. Play is still appropriate. Play is still meaningful. And all of that social emotional stuff is still valuable too. I mean, I could tell you plenty of stories of students. We go all the way through 8th grade of our middle school students who maybe have trouble connecting in the classroom. And when those loose parts come out, they find better and more effective ways to engage with their peers, which is really fantastic. But the cognitive benefits of play start to take center stage, especially when you are advocating for the right to include those. And I'm sorry that my dog's whining behind me. The glory days of Zoom presentations during COVID times. When you're advocating to an administrator, why should we have this mess on the playground? Why is it important to make sure that we protect recess as a part of the school day? And we do all the way through 8th grade. There's cognitive benefits when we can see their classroom learning extending to the playground and vice versa. So in these 2 images, the one on the left is a group of 3rd graders who had taken it upon themselves to develop a pulley system, really just for fun. And it took trial and error and figuring out what is the right amount of force, what's the right amount of friction, which is the right rope to use, how much can I put in this bucket, how many of us does it take to pull on it. All of the physics, force, motion, gravity, friction, simple machines, balanced and unbalanced forces, all of that's at play. Those are all things that we can tap into in science class, right? But this is something they took on just for fun, and they worked and they persevered, and they found that if they got too close to the edge of these poles where they meet, that they were going to get hung up, and they had to find just the right place to balance it. That sometimes took 3 of them if they put too much in that bucket. These were all things that they were intrinsically motivated to do. They tapped into their innate resilience, their curiosity, and their ability to understand and develop further understanding of the world around them. The student in the picture on the right is a 5th grader who he spent his entire 30+ minutes on the playground working and working and working to get this strange tower balanced perfectly with some items from mostly what the younger kids use from Mud Kitchen. You can see some bowls and sand buckets and colanders there. There's an old paint tray and a partially deflated basketball. And he worked, and he'd get it balanced and it would topple. And then he would rearrange, looking for center of gravity, looking for how to get those things positioned just right so that it balances. Again, you hear people throw that grit word around. This is real perseverance. This is a kid who is resilient in his learning, in a state of flow, and collecting that data from his trials in his head and applying his learning over and over again in a way that's engaging to him and that he can apply in a variety of settings in the future. Play is learning. So I've mentioned flow several times, and flow is a word that I hear a lot in educational circles as well, and Angela will probably touch on that specific definition as well. But when we talk about it in play work, it's very similar to a definition you may have heard in education, but it's when you're absorbed, fully absorbed in your play. You're in a play flow, and this can last for minutes, it can last for hours, it can last sometimes for days at a time. And I've seen it last over the course of days, interrupted by, we went in from recess, somebody else messed up my things, and when I came back out the next day, I found those things and I started working on it again. I've seen kids continue the same play scenario in that state of continued, though interrupted, flow over the course of several days. The child is, as Angela mentioned in our definition of play, active, alert, engaged, and non-stressed. They're working on something because they're excited about it. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't sometimes become frustrated or annoyed, that there's not sometimes conflict if there's a group of children working together, but they continue on that project because they want to, not because anyone told them to, and they're in a state of active, alert, non-stressed engagement. And there is structure, even if it's not visible. Sometimes this takes some watching, especially if the children are younger, but not necessarily so. Sometimes you can look at a child and it looks like they're just using up all the materials you gave them, or they're just making a mess. It looks chaotic. But if you pause, like I had to with the kids painting themselves, right? If you pause and watch, there's often much, much more at play. And what we have here is a student who was in kindergarten at the time. He used up most of a roll of duct tape and several boxes and some tubing to make this communication system that to him was quite intricate. There's a lot of imagination going on here, as well as, what's actually happening. And he wanted to pull every adult that walked by to the side and have us talk through his communication system, his tube. And none of those things that he taped to the tube had any actual purpose to the adult eye, but to him they did. And that was part of the process. And he was engaged in this over the course of kindergarten, goes out twice a day, over the course of both his recesses, before he finally got to the point here that he was having us talking to a principal through the other end there. Flow is, it's that state of learning and engagement that we want kids to be engaging in. It's what we see in artists and scientists as adults as well, that state of flow.
And I'd add that in creativity research that, so Mahai Csikszentmihalyi in creativity research also talks about this state of flow. And so where I come into play research is specifically from the angle of creativity research. So I'm in the field of gifted and talented. That's where my degrees and my expertise is from. And so within gifted and talented is, for whatever reason, the field of creativity in many cases. And so Mahai Csikszentmihalyi writes and researches creativity, and specific is this idea of flow. And so I found it fascinating when Sylvan was first telling me about flow in play and describing the idea here. And there are um, some slight distinctions in terms of the two, because flow in creativity can be more, I don't want to say negative, but it can have describing how to say this, consequences. But so for example, you can be in such a state of flow that you might forget to eat for 4 days, because the only thing that is important is whatever the research is, whatever the art is, whatever the engagement is. And so it flow can focus, it's a hyper focus to the point of nothing else is possibly important. And so there is some aspects that can be seen as negative to others. So one aspect might be almost a loss of the ability to be reflective in terms of the ability to critically analyze what you're doing, why you're doing. Is this good? Is this bad? It just is. It just, everything you're doing is, it's creation. It's what this is. It just, nothing else matters. And so it doesn't matter if you haven't seen your children in 4 days. It doesn't matter if there are dishes, food, everything piled up around. It doesn't matter if, well, that's a really bad example, but if anyone's seen The Aviator and Leonardo DiCaprio, oh, that was a bad way of saying his name. Did Leonardo DiCaprio urinating in bottles and stacking them up around the room? That can happen in states of flow. I'm not saying that's what was going on in that situation. It just sort of popped into my head. But it doesn't matter if that's how you're using the restroom. What matters is what's happening in front of you. The creativity, what's happening, the science experiment. That's what matters. Not going to the bathroom.
It's interesting. We don't usually think of that behind the scenes though, right? And it's interesting that you framed it in those terms, because we often just see the work of genius that arises from that, right? When somebody's been in that state of flow. And I quoted in the piece that we wrote together for Parenting for High Potential, Robert Rodriguez, because I just heard this podcast with him, and I was just taken with him talking about how when things go wrong, that's the best, and how he does the entire, everything that he does is shot, scored by Robert Rodriguez. And it's all about that state of flow, like just letting it come, just letting that art roll through. But when you hear it, it sounds like play, and it sounds joyful for him. And you read about him like filming El Mariachi, like in the wheelchair with his camera. But we were listening to it going, well, when is he with his family? Like, when is he doing anything else? And so, you want a life balance, and we don't often think of that, but then we see that's why gifted and creativity intersect as well, right? Like the works of creative, productive genius often arise from this state of flow. And hopefully, the person is healthy enough to be balancing their own needs and the needs of those around them with it. But that hyper focus is where genius happens.
No, I'm not saying the person has any issue with their hyperfocus. I'm saying others around them might have complaints about their hyperfocus. But that's the point. They don't. They are not, and that's sort of that loss of the reflective self-conscious. They aren't reflecting on that piece. They're good because they're in the state of flow, right? What matters is what's in front. The art, the science, the math,
or the play, and so it doesn't matter if you're
because what they're
covered in mud.
Play, right? What they're in is a state of intense play. And you can look at scientists, you can look at mathematicians, and they will describe that when they are in, and some people call it in the zone rather than in flow, but they will say at that point their work is play. And that's sort of the piece, is that they enjoy it to that level that it is play. It is fun for them. I'm not going to say I'm in flow 99% of the time, but I work a lot. But I truly enjoy my work, that it doesn't feel like when I'm, 2:00 in the morning and writing or something. It's fun for me. Like, I love writing. I love writing articles, and I love working with students and that kind of thing. So for me, it is enjoyable. I'm not saying I'm in flow all the time, but it's not something that I have to force myself to do. And so it's sort of that, if you have a job that you enjoy doing, it doesn't feel like work kind of thing. But flow is that times 100. That sort of idea of, if you have a job you love to do, flow is the extreme level of that. I think we went way longer on this slide than we intended to.
Yeah.
But it
was flow.
Yeah, we were, that's where we were. But it is really interesting how that crosses from play research to creativity research, really beyond even creativity research, to gifted and eminence research, which is a smaller facet of gifted research. Oh, this is me again. So this is, again, I swear we look at, I use research other than Peter Gray, but this is from Peter Gray. And these are some of Sylvan's joyful students, again, because why use photo stock when you have beautiful babies that we know? And so this is should be from his book, rather than, we have some, I have links to some of the articles, but also the book that most of what we are quoting here comes from the book. But when we look at play, and what he studied was the fact that everything we know about play tells us that there's some parts, some effects that we would expect when play is deprived. Because play is where children learn that they have agency, right? That they have some control in their lives. And that play is where they're in control, and play is where they learn how to control. It's where they have those building blocks, right? It's where they learn about control. And Peter Gray studied and looked at correlations, and we know that correlation doesn't prove causation. But that over the decades since the 1980s, that there has been a decline in play, but that play is where students or children learn problem solving and learn that the world is not so scary. But since there's been a decline in play, there's also been, when children learn these skills, there has coincidentally been a correlating rise in anxiety. Play is where children experience joy and they learn that the world is not so bad. Coincidentally, there has been a correlating rise in depression. Play is when children learn how to get along with their peers. It's where they learn how to see different points of view. It's where they practice empathy, real time practice and empathy, where they learn that if I don't change this rule, my friend is going to quit the game, because play means that you're always free to quit. But play also means that I can change the rules midway. And if I don't do this, my friend will quit. And so now maybe I'm going to do this so that they won't quit. Right. And so this is how I learn all of these different skills all together. So there's been a decline in free play, and coincidentally, there has been a correlating rise in narcissism. There has been a decline in empathy. There has been a decline in internal locus of control, while at the same time we've seen an increase in anxiety and depression. Play is where we learn creativity and creative thinking skills. And while there has been a decline in free play, there has coincidentally also been a correlating decline in creative thinking. And so we can see a correlation, we can see a decline in play that's linear with these declines. But we can also say that correlation does not imply causation. We can just say it's awful coincidental that these things are happening at the same time. We can also look at Stuart Brown's work, and it is awfully compelling when you look at his psychological autopsy of the Texas Tower massacre, and his work that showed that really looking at all the interviews that his team did, and it really showed that a incredibly compelling factor was the lack of play in the Texas Tower murderer's life as a young child, and as a child throughout his life, and even the lack of control he experienced as an adult, and looking at that correlation throughout, and that being a potential impetus for what drove him to making one of the first independent decisions he made in his life, which was a killing spree. And so, we have correlations, but they are pretty impressively coincidental to not be able to imply causation. So one thing that I have always believed, if you want to know what kids think, we should ask them. And so I like this study in particular, which is an investigation of play from the voices of kiddos. And the kiddos said that play is renewing, it was motivating, it's focusing, it enhanced their work. And so what this study is it looked at focus groups of 5th and 6th grades, and these were specifically tag students. And they interviewed students, and they were across urban, suburban, and rural school districts in the Midwest. They were asked about the value of play, and they were asked specifically in cognitive, physical, and social domains. And they said that play was necessary. 100% of kids agreed that they thought it was necessary to play. They saw it as a renewal activity. It was an opportunity to relax, being able to take a breather and then return and focus. They thought being able to have time to play was a way to increase attention. It was a motivating activity in order to come back and focus in learning. They thought that play developed teamwork. So these were kids answering on their own in the focus groups and saying that they thought it developed teamwork and problem-solving skills. They thought it helped them learn. And they said, explaining some of these, that it helped them learn in terms of both structured learning and experiential learning. Um, and they said it, in terms of that, they specified that it was both in their regular classroom and their tag classroom. So they didn't say it was in particular one kind of classroom or another. And they also talked about some barriers that they had towards play. And they felt that they had too much chores and homework to really experience enough time playing. I can't imagine my kids ever saying that. I don't know about yours, but that was a barrier they felt at home. But beyond that, what was interesting were after school sports, sibling activities, and practicing instruments. So the activities that parents put kids in to have them occupied, to engage their minds, to engage their bodies, the kids saw as barriers to being able to engage in play. But that was, I always think it's really interesting to hear from what kids say. And I thought it was particularly interesting to hear that kids saw play as developing teamwork and problem solving skills, renewing, and this correlates with research in terms of some of the origins and the developmental aspects of play. Oh, did that go through two slides? Oh, no, it didn't. I thought it went through two slides, but it didn't.
So we talked to you about the value of play in kids' enjoyment of school and their lives in general, their ability to connect with each other, their ability to enter a state of flow and hone their resilience and their perseverance and their critical reasoning and their creativity. And I feel like a lot of that's probably preaching to the choir. You probably are attending sessions at this particular conference because you already understand at least some of, if not many of, or all of the many valuable aspects of play. And you get this and you want this for kids. But what I sometimes find is that people say, yes, they need to play. That's great. Let's give them recess. Put them out to the playground. There's a playground. There's a wonderful playground. Look at this equipment that we have. And then the children are faced with a static playground, static play equipment, and adults in the space telling them how to use that stuff correctly. We don't go up the slide. We don't climb on that. Don't stand on the swing. Don't swing on your belly. Don't try to jump through that. Don't tie that thing to that thing. That could be dangerous, right? We have a lot of fears as adults. And we also, well, when we were kids, we just had the playground and we kind of forget how much time at recess we spent digging in the dirt or looking for sticks or finding acorns or catching frogs or whatever it may have been. I mean, I grew up in the country and we had, the big tall metal slide that burned your legs in the summertime and you could fall off of it over the hard packed.
I remember that.
Yeah, and so first of all, there was much peril on our playgrounds, much safer now. And there's also a lot of research to indicate that static play equipment that has like one purpose, and there's probably a teacher out there making sure you don't use it wrong. This does not give kids real meaningful play. It doesn't give them real meaningful opportunities to engage with one another. They can't manipulate their environment, so they don't have that sense of empowerment. And there's no creativity happening. You go up the ladder, you wait your turn, you go down the slide. None of those thought processes are happening. So we really have to shift our thinking on what a play space really looks like. And that's where we bring in the theory of loose parts. One of the many things that I love about play work, and I love many things about it, are the intersections between other fields. And so loose parts, which is a term that comes up often, and many of you are probably already familiar, was actually developed by an architect, Simon Nicholson, who kind of coined the term of loose parts in 1971, was an architect by trade. And the theory of loose parts is this. If they're loose parts, they can be moved, they can be carried, they can be combined, redesigned, lined up, taken apart, and put back together in multiple ways. These materials empower a creative imagination. And the more materials and individuals are involved, the more ingenuity takes place. And that goes without saying almost. Once you hear it, it's like, of course. The more materials and individuals involved, the more ingenuity takes place. And in these images, you can see kids manipulating materials in a variety of ways. They have plans that they've developed together. They're working together. They're communicating. They're manipulating those materials. They're making mistakes. They're fixing them. They're trying again. And all of this emerges from that theory of loose parts, which actually has some roots in play that was observed post-World War II in children in cities in the UK playing in what was basically rubble. They found that kids were so engaged and were being playful kids again in the wreckage of war, because there was so much for them to manipulate and create in that space, and it was therapeutic. So to move on a little bit more about loose parts and loose parts theory, and here you can see kids again manipulating materials in a variety of ways: cloth, old sheets, cardboard, tape. Somebody has a long stick of PVC pipe back there in the background. Loose parts theory is about remembering that the best play comes from things that allow children to play in many different ways and on many different levels. Environments that include loose parts are infinitely more stimulating and engaging than static ones. And again, once you hear that articulated, it seems like a no-brainer, but we often don't think about that because we think of things like playground design, and not to disparage any sessions at this particular conference that focus on that, because I know that there are some, and there is certainly a value to good play equipment. I feel like we have good play equipment. There's lots of climbing spaces. You can see the rock wall back there. There's certainly a lot of value in that, but adding loose parts in allows for richness. The girls in the picture on the right are fifth graders who had a blast creating swings from large pieces of cloth, twisting each other up, pushing each other, spinning. And I don't know how much time you spend with fifth graders, but they spend a lot of time wanting to look cool and kind of disaffected. To watch them playing joyfully, and so do our sixth, seventh, and eighth graders when we bring out the loose parts, is a balm for the soul. That childlike enthusiasm is in them. It's just not sparked by the same slide they've been looking at since kindergarten. And so our next slide here is a quote from Laura Malaguzzi, who is the founder of the Reggio Emilia approach, which I think many of us, especially those of us who have spent time in early childhood settings, are familiar with. Just as a very quick crash course for those who aren't, Reggio Emilia approach is an approach to learning that sees the child, the teacher, and the environment as all being teachers in the environment, that everything matters. And so thinking about that, everything matters, the environment itself is a teacher. Keep that in mind with this quote, that the wider the range of possibilities we offer children, the more intense will be their motivations and the richer their experiences. And what more could we want for kids than that? And so here, I feel like these two pictures show, again, the wide variety of possibilities, limited only by the child's imagination. A bucket is a drum. A bucket is a stepping stool for building things higher. This is an elaborate trap on the right, made out of bungee cords and jump ropes that then you weave your way through. They worked on this over the course of several play periods. Our drummers have a great time with those. One of my favorite installments, hard to capture on film, was the day that my kindergarten drummers discovered that if you poured water on the drums and you drummed, you could see the vibrations of the sound literally flying up into the air. And it was beautiful, and it was fascinating, and it was science learning at its finest. The wider the range of possibilities we offer children, the more intense will be their motivations and the richer their experiences, the deeper their learning. So.
And then time to creativity. This is a quote from Peter Gray, and I will take a bit of a different stance on part of this quote. At the beginning, he says, you can't teach creativity. All you can do is let it blossom. And then he wraps up with a great deal of research has shown that People are most creative when infused by the spirit of play, when they see themselves as engaged in a task just for fun. And again, you're able to read the full quote on your own, but I want to highlight those parts. And because again, the play research and creativity research overlap to a great extent. And then that leads into research on giftedness and eminence. And the one thing I want to sort of point out with a caveat is in creativity research, we actually talk a lot about how we can teach creativity and how we certainly can foster it and teach creativity strategies. I'm not saying that we can give everyone a paintbrush and make everyone into the greatest painters. Not everyone is going to be a Frida Kahlo, and not everyone is going to be Leonardo da Vinci kind of thing, right? I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you can make any 3-year-old young artist into a creative genius eminence. I'm saying that you can foster creativity, you can develop creativity. And so it's about how you fuse creativity and creative thinking in your classroom. And there is a lot that you can do to teach creativity and put that into your classroom. And so that is a sort of point that I wanted to disagree with in terms of this quote. And I say that because I wrote a course specifically called creativity, and I have the course is creativity, critical thinking, and now I'm blanking on the course. Creative problem solving. Sorry, that was the last. Creativity, critical thinking, and creative problem solving. And so that's one of my 4 courses in terms of gifted certification that my students take in order to get their add-on to their license. And so we actually only spend half of the semester working on how you infuse those strategies in your classroom. We actually spend the other half of the semester working on how you use those strategies as a professional in advocacy in your classroom as a teacher leader. And using that as advocating for gifted children. So it's sort of a dual purpose class, but I could easily offer a full semester on creativity. I took one, in fact, for my master's degree. And so it's not at all something that I would say that you can't teach. You absolutely can teach. But I do agree with this idea of allowing it to blossom and allowing it to foster throughout activities in your classroom. And so as we transition into this next section, a lot of what we're going to talk about is this idea of how we can provide more authentic learning experiences that integrate some of these principles of play, that integrate some principles of creativity. Again, we're not talking about edukifying play. We're making a clear distinction of this is what you can do in your classroom, but it takes components of play and some of those aspects of play that are naturally learning, how play allows us to naturally learn and puts it into the classroom. Just sort of, again, keep in mind in the back of your mind that caveat that we believe that play is play, and that when we talk about putting free play in the classroom, we mean as play. But this is where there is some overlap, where some of the principles from play really have a place in the classroom as academic activities.
Yes. So if it were up to me, every school in the United States would provide, in the whole world, would provide both really large chunks, at least 30 minutes, preferably 45 to an hour, of real meaningful play for all the grades, loose parts, really a free environment where kids can truly play, as well as a classroom setting where some of these principles begin to infiltrate the classroom. Through those of you who work in schools, you're probably familiar with terms like problem-based learning or inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, hands-on. There's a lot of lingo and jargon that kind of gets thrown around, much of which I find to be actually meaningful. But I want to draw the distinction really clearly between play and play work and education. They're not the same. They're not the same. As when I'm an educator, when I'm a teacher in the classroom and wearing that hat, I can't be a play worker. I'm not trained as a play worker either, and I won't use that title, although I find great inspiration in that field of study in everything that I do. So just to reiterate, I strongly believe that every child should have the opportunities for free play, because it's what strengthens them as humans in all of their social interactions and all of their self-awareness and self-advocacy, self-confidence, self-esteem, and all of those cognitive processes, critical reasoning, creativity. All of those things are honed and fostered through play from the very earliest ages all the way up through adulthood, if you can hang on to it. And in the classroom, the more of those principles, the more of that awareness that children are capable, children are brilliant, children are intrinsically motivated and deserving of that empowerment, that voice and choice in the classroom, and that they're going to learn best if they can kind of explore and tinker with it and ask their own questions. The more we bring those ideas into the classroom and allow for some merging and melding, the better our kids are going to learn, and the more they're going to enjoy school, and the stronger citizens we're going to be creating. So I'm going to be talking about applying principles from loose parts play in the classroom setting. Maker spaces, the kinds of design process engineering kind of learning through something like an invention convention, and just generally building and creating, offering children opportunities to really make something authentic. And we do utilize the Renzulli school-wide enrichment model in my school. So if you're familiar with Joseph Renzulli and his work in creativity and gifted education, you're going to see, I think, some clear intersections here as well. And so in this picture, we have, if you zoom in, there's an old TV in my classroom that hasn't worked in a million years. It says, think outside this box. And then that's an image of some students working on a video treatment they're creating of the book Fever, about yellow fever. They've written a script. They have the little action. That's what you can see in motion there. And they're filming it on our school's Padcaster in my space. So an example of students creating and using technology in innovative ways. So I like to apply principles from play to creativity learning in the classroom. And I love that Angela drew that distinction too between the value of creativity organically emerging through play, but then it's also something that you can teach and support and scaffold in the classroom. I like that because it demonstrates that distinction between true play and those kinds of ideas being connected in the classroom, that there can be an interplay and interweaving between them. It doesn't have to be just one or the other, and there's so much value to those. So here are some images from my classroom, my big questions poster over one of my many shelves in my makerspace of stuff, nuts and bolts and screws, and I think in there's some buttons, and I don't even know actually what's in those drawers right now. Paintbrushes, squeeze bottles, there's extra wires in that red bowl. And my big questions: how does your perspective affect how you see and understand the world? How many ways can you solve a problem? How many ways can you answer a question? What do you wonder? What do you think? And how can you back that up with evidence? What's the point? How can we connect these ideas to our lives? And then insert your question here. And I mean that, never stop wondering. I tell kids that their questions are more important than their answers. That's how we learn. Failure is more important to success because that's what keeps going. And so some things you may be familiar with are the Odyssey of the Mind, which many schools participate in. And then the ideas of creative problem solving in the future. You want them to have those skills, and then problem-based learning, which is something else I've had some training in, and I believe really strongly in, giving kids a real world problem to solve, and then setting them loose to find their own solutions to it. So next, so applying principles from play to investigative projects. Again, thinking about play as a separate field, but one that can intersect with good classroom practice in really empowering kids to have voice, to have choice, to investigate their own ideas. So looking at small group or independent research projects, very student-led, very student-directed. This is prime for differentiation. The more open-ended something is, the more it naturally self-scaffolds. Kids are entering in at their own level, and you're able to challenge them from wherever their starting point is and grow them from there. The more open-ended something is, the more differentiated it naturally is for every learner in your group. The why, our kids are able to come in with their own why, connects with the content. You're going to be engaging those standards. You're going to be engaging those standards in much more meaningful ways than something that was 100% contrived by a teacher. Students can have choice in the topic. They can have choice in the process. They can have choice in the product, or all of those things. And so the sequence here on this slide, ending with this lovely image of several of my fifth graders saying goodbye to one of our tagged monarchs. Our school has pollinator gardens now. It didn't always. I began a couple of years ago with students who were interested in botany. They want to learn about the parts of a plant. How does a plant grow from a seed? And we did walk around campus. And we're an urban campus. We call it the downtown school because we're downtown. And so there's a lot of pavement. There's roads all around us. It's not like we're adjacent to fields and trees. As you saw, our playground is concrete and astroturf. So kids were noticing, well, we've got some bees and butterflies on these butterfly bushes over here and these flowers over here, but there's not a lot of green space. And they wanted to know more about the pollinators that we're finding. Why are they important? So we dug into the value of pollinators. We dug into how bees are becoming threatened. We are seeing less and less bees, and that's a problem for our food supply. And the kids became very passionately concerned in this. This was something they took on as their own personal cause. And so I had several kids who wrote to the mayor and to some city planners and said, hey, we're at the downtown school. We don't have a lot of green spaces. We could use some more. We're concerned about pollinators. We learned about this in class. What can we do about that? Can we have permission from the city to put some plantings in around our school? We've got this great space behind the school and people are parking there and we're not even sure they're supposed to. So we got a letter back from the mayor and tremendous support for students' ideas. We got a letter back from city planning saying, yes, that area behind the school does belong to the city, but we'd be happy to lease it to you if you send us your plans for what you want to build there. And the students, all of the ones that were involved in this particular project and had taken it on their own, made blueprints and they graphed out and they had them to scale. And this is what we're going to grow in each one. And so the city gave them permission. They gave us a lease. And we then had to put together a campaign to let people know you can't park here anymore, which puts yourself in the mind of an elementary schooler. They were pumped to go out and flyer cars. You can't park here anymore starting on Monday because we're protecting the pollinators. They all made these informational flyers explaining the importance of pollinators, explaining why we were taking these parking spots to build beds. And they flyered cars. We marked off the spots and we began building raised beds on concrete because we couldn't exactly jackhammer it up. So I had a parent volunteer who is an engineer by trade come in and help the kids with planning and sawing and constructing raised beds in that space. And you can see kids engaged in the process of that in the next picture, constructing the beds and getting ready to plant them. And then after we were able to build those beds, we got a grant. We filled them with soil. We planted milkweed in them, and we now have the pictures aren't. Oh. And we now are able to watch the entire life cycle of monarch butterflies, which are a valuable pollinator in and of themselves. From year to year, we see the mothers come and lay their eggs. I've had students actually witness that. We see the tiny, tiny first instar caterpillars grow and grow and grow as they eat. And then we bring in the chrysalises so that we can protect them and watch that process. and then we tag them and release them. We've yet to have any of our tag butterflies actually get recorded in the sanctuaries, but we've only been doing this for a couple of years now. And students also, not pictured, is a mason bee home that students also planned and constructed with the help of that parent who is an engineer. So again, the catalyst was what are the kids into, what do they want to do, and something they felt passionately about, then leading to all of the kinds of skills that we usually teach in the classroom in a contrived way. Writing a formal business letter, research into a topic, finding perimeter and area and volume, and then figuring out the cost of the soil to go into those beds. The kids did all of that because they wanted to. So this is not, I'm not calling this play, but putting myself a little bit more on the sidelines. Play work in a true play work environment is what's called a horizontal power structure versus vertical, teacher up, kids down. I can never be truly horizontal because I'm a teacher in a school, but the more I try to level that playing field and let the kids lead, taking some inspiration from that play field, the more empowered the kids become to lead their own learning. Again, natural differentiation, natural motivation, and learning that feels like those vibrant memories of play that we have from childhood. And kind of felt a little illicit too. We took away parking spaces from adults and told them they couldn't park there anymore. Not quite building a fire, but we're getting
Sorry
there.
about that, Sylvan. I had dogs trying to break through my door, so I had to
I get it. I get it. I wasn't sure if I just wasn't seeing it on my end. So so then we have an equation here, which, you know, play is a little bit looser than that, but to articulate it like this, I think is helpful to see. When we have the appropriate materials and tools, truly open-ended, loose parts materials, plus opportunities, as free and open as possible, plus other children, plus freedom equals playful empowerment. And I'm not sure that I could overestimate the value of students feeling really empowered. Kids don't get a lot of opportunities to feel powerful because they're children. We don't give children a lot of power. And then the less privilege that child may have based on other aspects of their identities, their communities, their experiences, the less and less powerful they're going to feel. The more we can allow children real, true opportunities to be empowered, the stronger their sense of self, the more meaningful their learning, and the more we're going to see their real genius and their real creativity come out. And so these images are chosen. Big one is an image of true play, kindergarten girls who were engaged deeply in something imaginative. And I wish I could remember the specific scenario, but that's, I think, 4 buckets stuck together, filled with PVC pipe and some tubes and various other things. It was quite heavy for 2 kindergarten girls. The one girl has actually started trying to move it on her own, and her friend came over and started helping her. But that process of collaboration and all of the planning that went into, these are the things we need, and we need all these buckets. And then the perseverance to carry that all the way across the playground. And it was pure, open-ended, joyful play with no particular adult and meat and product in mind. The picture on the right is that's a class that I took outside to investigate our one of our other milkweed and pollinator-friendly gardens. So we have milkweed and zinnias there, and you can see some things that students had built, the tomato cages and some netting to protect those plants from basketballs. That's on our playground. It's right by the basketball court. But the kids are deeply invested and engaged in looking for the caterpillars, seeing how they've grown, finding the evidence of a leaf of a hole in it, because by midday, caterpillars aren't on the leaves, they're underneath. And so while that is not a play experience at all, that's a classroom experience, both that curiosity that sparks, I feel, from having those play experiences, and the sense of power the kids have to guide their own learning and ask their own questions, which they do, and they feel free to challenge, which I think is important. You know, we want a populace who questions authority and doesn't blindly follow. It makes for a more meaningful experience, and they were engaging truly like field scientists, not like kids who've been given an assignment. So on that playful empowerment, I feel in a setting where kids are offered all of that, the whole buffet, carries from moment to moment throughout the school day, and really builds what we want to see in our kids.
So we have, I think, about 5 minutes left till we hit the maximum allowable time. So we are going to go as quickly as possible through the next section, which is the last section for the record. But this is just a quote in terms of just to think about what play really is in terms of childhood development, and what it means to the child in terms of who they are and what they can express. So I'll just let you read and process. Feel free to pause on your own and reflect. And this is the section really on how do we explain play and the wolf at the door. But hopefully you've been getting some of this throughout as we've been discussing, and really thinking and reflecting on that throughout our entire session. And these are some of the ways that as people come up and think about what we're doing as we engage in free play in our classroom, and are engaging in some of these activities that are free play, this is what's happening. We are developing fine motor skills with what we're doing. We're gaining an awareness of the environment, of what's happening around us, and an appreciation of the world around us, which is incredibly important. There's communication always around. Keep in mind some of those elements of play that are important in terms of creating rules, and that has to do with communication. If we're inside, outside, there's the surroundings, and they're using both physical and verbal expression. We're looking at body spatial awareness, and you can list it as acquiring, you can list it as improving. So looking along the spectrum of where you are in age, in development, you might want to use different indicator words there. You might be understanding sensory systems. You might be communicating about sensory systems. So again, depending on where you are in the age level, the grade level, you might use different indicator words. But again, these are all different aspects of what is happening during play. Are we listening? Are we talking? Are we thinking? Are we feeling? But we're using all of our senses depending on what is happening. Are we doing something where we might be thinking and feeling our heart rates? And so really thinking about everything that you can explain in terms of tying something to a specific standard, or tying something to a specific element that you can use. And so part of this is also knowing whatever standards, which we'll get to in just a moment. Problem solving skills. I hope you've seen that repeated throughout what we've been talking about, and how important problem solving skills. And these are all, by the way, ones that you can pretty easily tie to loose play in particular. But problem solving skills, all of the examples we've shown of loose play, you can really easily see problem solving skills throughout. You can really see the Eduspeak in this particular one. An exploration of materials in order to determine uses in a problem-solving environment. Does that not sound like an objective you could write on a lesson plan? So what we're doing here is looking at uses, looking at how you would put something in a particular environment, looking at problem solving, right? So you want to think about how you're phrasing things and how you are coming up with an explanation of what you're saying to keep the wolf at the door. But again, please keep in mind that the purpose of this is protecting your play, right? This isn't justifying a lesson plan, it's justifying play in the classroom. using the engineer design process to solve a community problem. So this is if you're thinking about kids using free play and loose parts because they're playing with buckets. And you're saying, oh yeah, this is what they're doing. They're using the engineering design process to solve a community problem and exploring community issues. When what they're doing is using, using the buckets and using and using the fabric to create things on the loose playground outside. Using those, you saw the kids playing with the buckets and the pulley systems. Well, they were clearly exploring scientific concepts through open-ended exploration of non-standard units of measurement. I was there that day. I took a lot of those pictures. But you know what they were doing? They were legit talking about the pulley system while playing. They really were. They were talking about pulleys and talking about what they were doing in science class as well while they were playing. But that is, if they were doing that in the classroom, how you can explain it. So when we talk about things like task commitment and flow and grit, and the reason we put things like this on here is we understand that some districts have these commitment to some of the Eduspeak, the jargon, the next shiny thing. So that's an equity, detour that you can sometimes get on, is this idea of following the next shiny thing. But we do understand that sometimes that's what districts have, had they bought into, oh, we're going to follow this principle, we're going to follow this, we're going to buy this curriculum. And truly, if you look at, so if you look at Duckworth's work on grit, that doesn't go necessarily, that's a very different kind of grit than this idea of, well, we're all going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps because that's what we do. And it's very contrary to, so one of my favorite Martin Luther King Jr. quotes is this speech he gave, and I'm not going to destroy it by attempting to quote it word for word myself without looking it up. But he basically talks about what a travesty it is to say this, pull yourself up by a bootstrap, to a man that has no shoes, because of the structural and systemic racism that has, left a man without shoes because of the environment of racism that he has had to endure. And so that's that piece, that the problem with grit is, it assumes that the problem is the kid, and the kid needs to have grit to pull themselves out of the problem, rather than recognizing that the problem is the system, that the educational system is broken. And so that's sort of when Sylvan was alluding to sort of the issues with grit, that's sort of the issue. It's not that sort of individually having grit and determination is bad. It's that when the answer to a school district's issue is these kids need more grit, let's train them how to have grit, rather than, hey, let's fix the system. That's
and recognize that they already have it. I mean, they are persevering and showing resilience in all these aspects of their lives that actually matter. And when you have done that all day to get to school, and then here you are, and you're being asked to do this mundane task.
Yeah, exactly. You've shown 500 kinds of grit just to get yourself to school already, right. And yet, you're being asked to do something else, and and so that's sort of the issues with grit. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with Duckworth's work, anything like that. It's just from a systemic equity point of view. And so we're not dissing grit either. It's just from an equity point of view, that's sort of the reasoning behind grit. But anyway, so, so anything like that. But if that's what your school is going for, that's sort of like we're going with the grit mentality, or we're going with this, or we're going with that, tie the play into that. Same thing with critical reasoning and creative thinking. Those are really easy to tie some of these loose play experiences in with. some broader play experiences, not necessarily loose parts play. So these are some specific objectives that you could write. Today we are gaining an appreciation of cause and effect through the application of real world experiences. And again, sort of tie that to something specific. I'll read another one, but then you guys can read, you guys can screenshot, you guys can pause the recording. Explore communication and negotiation through the creation of a structured system of rules. That's very specific because that comes straight from the definition of play, right? So again, we have fine and gross motor skills, ethics and fairness. Oh, my dogs are going crazy out there. So this again is about knowing your audience and knowing what is specifically happening within your school, what they're focusing on. So if your school is focusing on authentic and real world experiences, I hope they are, that's pretty cool. But so there's some words that you can use in your, your explanation, whether it's writing an objective on the board or whether it's what to say when someone comes in. So there's some thinking skills words there, as well as thinking about tying to the NGSS framework or the science framework or the C3, the social studies framework, thinking about those disciplinary core ideas within the science framework. Those are really good things to tie it into. If your district is big on social emotional learning, one thing I would say is that that follows the same line as grit in terms of Dina Simmons is someone who I'd recommend looking up, but one thing she says, if it's done poorly, it's basically social emotional learning is basically white supremacy with a hug. And so look into her work in terms of how to do it, good ways to do it well. Dina Simmons, Simmons, but that is, those are again some key words to think about in terms of putting that to use. And that was my zip through those. I did not quite make it in 5 minutes, but it was still quick, I think. And here, our final quote. We're quote lovers. For you to pause and think and reflect upon.
And just to kind of wrap all of that together, because we touched very quickly on how so many of the things that pop up in as you speak, if done poorly, result in inequitable environments. You cannot provide an inequitable environment when it's truly led by the children, because when they are empowered and speaking for themselves, you've created an environment of equity and differentiation and real meaning and belonging for all of those kids, whatever their identities, whatever their home lives, whatever their communities, whatever their languages. When they lead, they have everything that they need. And I do love this. A child who does not play is not a child, but the man who does not play has lost forever the child who lived in him. We also have that child inside us. And so allowing ourselves to truly play and love what we're doing with the kids, and then therefore hear them and see things how they do, allows us to provide better, more meaningful environments in which they can learn.
And here is our contact information. And we love chatting with people. Clearly, we're chatters. Please contact us if you would like to talk more, and let us know if we can help you. And I'm just going to point out that I am wearing my US Play Coalition shirt.
Oh, nice.
Sorry that you guys couldn't see it. Well, I still haven't sent you that bracelet I bought you last year when I got this shirt. So just one day I will. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Sorry, the stop recording button is in here somewhere.